Okay, so that takes us to our board topics, and we start with our sustainability workshop with preservation and equity. Take it away, Jim.
Okay, I'm actually going to kick the introduction to Marin while I get the slideshow set up.
Thank you, Jim. We're going to tag team on this. And what we're doing this evening is essentially sharing with you a presentation that we made last Thursday to on Zoom to our staff colleagues in the city's Community Development and Neighborhood Services Department. So that's like 60 plus people that are, you know, from planning, zoning, building services, neighborhood services, and our administrative staff. And we wanted to be sure to share that same presentation with you as a follow-up to the discussion that you began in your work session last month on the topic of preservation and equity. We are going to be continuing to discuss this, you know, indefinitely in order to improve our practices and policies around this issue. So we thought it would be helpful, since we're doing a lot of work kind of day to day on this as staff, to share with you how we discussed it with our colleagues, and certainly make that information available to you, and also get any feedback or ideas you have based on the information that's in this particular presentation. So as a primary concern, what we're trying to do as staff, and certainly you know, this would be a matter of concern for you as well as a city commission, is to look at how our work in the city's Historic Preservation Division intersects with the city's broader equity and inclusion goals. And we're looking forward to hearing more from you on that, and happy to answer any questions you have about this tonight. Which, if you'd like, you can note any questions you have in the chat, and we can address those at the end, or you can simply chime in at the end with anything you'd like to discuss. So as we jump into it, I just want to clarify just a few basic concepts for you. So Jim, you can go ahead and switch the slide. Thank you. As the LPC, of course, you already have a strong understanding of historic preservation. We did go over that somewhat with our colleagues, just to make sure, because we have new people and such a variety of professionals in that group, that we did cover that with them. But the definition we presented was, it's the process we use to identify the important places in our community that have meaning or value, as well as the processes we use to maintain those places for the community's benefit. So that's just a really good kind of baseline definition for what preservation is, and it's broad and allows us to do a lot of things with that idea. When we talk about the power of place, which is a phrase that, as you know, is discussed a lot in preservation circles, we can be talking about how a place is a powerful tool to convey stories that are meaningful to us, but this idea can also refer to the implicit power structure that influences which buildings, sites, and places end up on that list of so-called important buildings. So when we use the term equity, I do want to clarify what we mean by that as well. We mean that this is a goal that is achieved when a person's race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or any other characteristics can no longer be used to predict life outcomes, and outcomes for all groups are improved when equity is achieved. So I think you probably know this, but if not, City Council recently revised our equity and inclusion objective, which guides all of our work. And it does ask us very clearly to advance equity for all, but it also specifies that we do so by leading with race. And there are, of course, important historical reasons for taking that stand, and it's something that we'll be doing as we move forward. So if the goal is to achieve equity, and if we are leading with racial equity, this discussion considers how equitable outcomes in our work in historic preservation may be limited by explicit and implicit biases, as well as by individual, institutional, and structural racism, and some of the ways we can begin working against those things. historic preservation is only as equitable as a community decides to make it. And, you know, it's a tool. It has universal utility in certain ways, but as we know it requires a subjective judgment in order to apply it and use it. And, you know, why is that? Well, in part because people and communities are always applying new insights about history when deciding what to highlight and what to save, what to celebrate. And also when deciding what stories to avoid or quietly forget because they're uncomfortable or they're difficult to face. So for that reason, you can really learn a lot about what a community values when you look at what place it chooses to save and carry forward into the future. And just on this slide, you know these buildings. These are two important examples of historic buildings in Fort Collins. Both reflect our agricultural history in some respects, but from very different social positions. The barn is a functional building from a prosperous local farm that was once spread over many acres east of town. And the other building, the Holy Family Catholic Church, represents the center of our earliest Hispanic community of sugar factory and beet field workers who didn't own the farms they worked on and worshiped and educated their children in segregation from the white community. So when we think about historic buildings and we think about preservation and equity, ultimately what we're really asking is, what stories do we tell about these places? What stories are we not telling? What is important to our community today, and what should we be focused on preserving?
So as Martin mentioned, what we choose to preserve or not preserve reflects our values, as not only as individuals, but as a community. And it's an important conversation because, especially as a lot of us know as preservation practitioners, these places have power. They have the power to instruct. They have the power to help us reflect on the past, whether it's personal or a community shared past. And they have the power to help us belong by connecting to histories that we have some relationship with. And that power is why preservation is not just about preserving, the lifestyles of the rich and famous that we sometimes get pigeonholed into, or preserving buildings as art, strong reflections of architecture, or just the places of community founders. So those would be places like, the Avery House or the Elizabeth Stone Cabin. There's always going to be room for those. That's not a part of preservation that's going away, but it's an incomplete vision for what preservation is supposed to be about. It's not just about cute buildings that have, a few alterations. It's also about preserving community fabric and heritage. And that means preserving places like workers' housing, enclaves of a particular racial or ethnic group that reflect the full story of our community is important. These are stories that are not necessarily apparent just from looking at a place. They're stories that have to be drawn out and how we interpret these sites. And so what does that full story look like? Here in Fort Collins, it's going to include places associated with Black American experiences in Fort Collins. That may be the modest home of the McDaniels family on Cherry Street. That's where Hattie McDaniels, a famous Oscar winner, the first Black American to win an Oscar for her role in Gone with the Wind. This is where she spent part of her life growing up when her parents moved from Kansas here to Fort Collins for a short period. But it also includes Latinx experiences like the Romeros, who lived at 425 10th Street. That's the photograph on the upper right. And these are, the Romeros were Mexican Americans. They moved to Fort Collins from Santa Fe and in about 1920 to work at Great Western Sugar. John Romero became a community leader. He was an advocate. He provided translating and notary services to folks in Tres Colonias and in the Holy Family neighborhood. And he supported child welfare projects. He would be considered a community leader by any respects. So that's one definition of that full story that sometimes are at least easy to celebrate. But it can also include sites of conscience. These are places where the story is not one to celebrate. It's one that can be traumatizing. It can be shameful, part of a struggle for civil rights. And the role of preservation there is to preserve sites to instruct, to provide instruction for future generations. And so those would be, speaking more nationally, places like the Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, which is there in the bottom left. You can see with the late Congressman John Lewis, who famously organized the march from Selma to Montgomery which went across this bridge and was attacked by Alabama State Police, where he was injured and received the scar on his head from being hit by a state trooper. It can also be the Stonewall Inn. If you're familiar with that, that's on the bottom right. That's in New York. That's the site of the so-called Stonewall riots in 1969, which are largely considered the pivotal sort of starting moment of the gay rights movement in the United States. So preservation it's materialistic by nature, as we know. I think most of us are quite familiar with that aspect of it, but it's not just about the stuff. It's not just about the materials and the building itself. It's about the stories that those buildings help us tell.
So the examples Jim just reviewed are really great for demonstrating different types of stories about places that matter, and to understand that those stories are rarely simple. And so one of our primary challenges as staff is figuring out how to work effectively, again, with that equity goal in mind, to wrangle with these complex histories and to work with you as a commission to do a better job of presenting those stories and recognizing those stories. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into another interesting example of a historic neighborhood in Fort Collins and talk a little bit more about the way we tell stories and about places that reinforce the power in those places. So the building in the upper left is a 1914 farmhouse at 1401 West Mulberry that sat on a farm property that had an orchard on it west of town, just south of Sheldon Lake. It's still there today, right just south of the lake at City Park. The land was in the county until about sometime in the 1950s. I can't remember the exact annexation date for the West Side annexation, but at the time that it was built, certainly it was in the county. And in the 1940s, while World War II was still in full swing, a man named Albert Slade bought the property as a retirement investment. And he and his wife moved into that little farmhouse just as the war was ending, and enjoyed living the gentleman farmer's life for a few years. But we, wanted to think a little bit more about, who was A.A. Slade, as he was known, Albert A. Slade. Interestingly, with a little bit of research, we learned that he's a product of Victorian England. He was born there in 1876 and immigrated to the United States with his parents as a very young child, and they settled in Iowa, and he became a naturalized US citizen at age 21. He went to college to become a school teacher, and he married a Iowa farmer's daughter named Nellie Hall. And while he was still a young teacher, he was stricken with tuberculosis, and he sought treatment at a sanatorium in Wyoming, where a lot of people, were seeking treatment at that time. And it was so good for his health that he and Nellie ultimately moved there, and they lived amongst a small colony of people who had moved to that part of Wyoming from their Iowa hometown. And those people, several of them, kind of moved up the power ranks in Wyoming over the next few decades. One of them became the governor of Wyoming, and Slade himself became the superintendent of the Laramie school system. So he was a prominent man in Laramie, and his contributions to the advancement of public school education in our region are one of the ways we could recognize him and his significance. In fact, there's an elementary school in Laramie, Slade Elementary School, that's a testament to the way that community recognizes him and his influence on their history. So once he was fully retired, as I mentioned, he was retiring as the war was going on. He and his wife did settle there just after the war, and their plan was to subdivide that farm ultimately and essentially fund their retirement. And so they did so, and they subdivided it, and they created the subdivision of Slade Acres, and they used the proceeds to spend about half the year in Arizona and then buy a little cabin up the Poudre River in the canyon. And some of the first homes that were built on that former farm site include modest examples of that minimal traditional style that you're familiar with, I'm sure. And of course, those were very popular just after the war. They represented an opportunity, a return of economic recovery, and then the ability for returning GIs to start families in a way that was supported very much so by local communities and by the federal government. So as the 50s wore on and Slade Acres built out, we see the introduction of some higher style mid-century modern gems, such as this really charming duplex with curtain walls that looks out over the lake, and is probably a building that you've noticed as you've driven along Mulberry. So we can tell that story, that traditional story of residential development in Fort Collins in the way that we often do in terms of its architecture, its growth pattern, the reason why that subdivision occurred at that place at that time. We can talk about the significance of Slade and his contribution to public education in the region, to post-war development in Fort Collins. All of that supports that general narrative of success and opportunity. But now let's look at this ad that ran in the local newspaper when the subdivided sites were being sold, and talk a little bit more closely about who Slade Acres was being built for. It was a beautiful location. It was a convenient location. And as the ad notes, it was a restricted location. You probably know what that means. And certainly the people who saw the ad knew what that meant. It meant white people only. And if you're wondering if that may be reading too much into it, let's look at the schedule of restrictions that are actually on the plat. In plain, stark language, you can look at restriction number 2, which notes, and I'll read it for you because I know it's hard to read, none of the lots in this subdivision shall ever be owned or occupied by any persons other than members of the Caucasian or white race, except the servants or guests of persons properly in ownership or occupancy hereunder. So, you know, we don't know exactly why Slade chose to include this restriction, the role that the lender played. You know, the same thing occurred on Circle Drive, which was platted at about the same time in 1948. And we can certainly speculate about everything that went into that based on what we know about Redline, what we know about financing, post-war financing, and the inherent racism that, you know, was built into that process. And we could even look more deeply into Slade and why Slade, you know, how Slade may have felt about that. But certainly, you know, it would change the story to do that. And the more that we look into that, the more it becomes a story of exclusion as much as it does about opportunity. So just to close on this one example, you know, we asked our fellow staff members to think about a couple of open-ended questions when we look at these places. I think it's important first to start with, how does this make us feel to encounter this history in our community, and to just come to terms with it. We need to understand that in order to be galvanized for how we're going to decide to move forward. So what does it mean to you? What should it mean to all of us? And what should it mean about the historical significance of the neighborhood? How should we acknowledge and use this information to work towards our equity goals? In the next slide, I want to tell you another story. So this is another hipped roof box, and it really helps us understand, again, how you simply cannot understand the significance of a building from the street. So this one looks somewhat like that Hattie McDaniel's residence that Jim showed you earlier. It's similar to that one. And this one is at 1005 West Oak Street. In 1922, it became the home of a man named Charlie Birdwhistle. He was a local African-American man, and his wife, Mamie. Mamie is shown on the far right. You may have seen this photo. Charlie's on the far left, Mamie's on the far right. This is a photo of Charlie and Mamie entertaining their guests in their home in the dining room of the house that you see above their photo. This photo actually hangs in the lobby of the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery, right across from the cafe, so you can see it there if you haven't already. And Charlie, before he came to Fort Collins, he was from Topeka, Kansas, and his parents had been slaves in Kentucky prior to emancipation. They were enslaved. And so Charlie, in the 1890s, he served as a sergeant in a regiment in the Spanish-American War, an African-American regiment. And so he was in Cuba in 1898, and he was a war veteran. And years later, after he had gone back to Topeka and was working there, he came to Colorado and was actually at the Stanley Hotel as a waiter, and then moved down to Fort Collins and spent the next 26 years living in our community, working at a variety of jobs, which included being the head waiter at the Northern Hotel, where he served President Roosevelt on his only visit to Fort Collins. And he was also a caretaker and janitor at the YMCA building that occupied the former Oak 140 site that we were discussing earlier tonight. And he also worked for the city in the Light and Power Department. So we can learn a few things from just looking at this one photo of Charlie and Mamie and their guests. We can see that they enjoyed a comfortable middle-class home on Oak Street and entertained there on occasion. We don't know who's in this photo with them. We know it was taken sometime in the 1920s. We know that Charlie's military pension that he received just before he got married helped them get established and helped them purchase this home. And we can learn a little bit more about what made his life noteworthy if we dig into our local newspaper. So one of the things we can learn about Charlie is that he was an African Methodist Episcopal Church pastor. He was ordained in the 1920s and conducted services in his home as well as around Colorado and other communities. And there's more to explore about that story, but I'll just briefly say here that in 1922, as soon as they married, the Bird Whistles announced to the local African-American community who gathered with them in their home to celebrate the occasion of their marriage that they intended to start an AME church in Fort Collins. And they began an effort to to find a suitable site and build a congregation, which ultimately did not come to fruition for reasons that we do not fully understand today. We also can learn that Charlie and Mamie's home served as an informal hotel and refuge for African Americans who were visiting Fort Collins for various reasons. For example, in 1927, there were Negro Aggie football recruits that came up from Denver, and they stayed with Charlie and Mamie at their home. In 1928, a visiting musical troupe from Mississippi known as the Piney Woods Singers stayed with the Bird Whistles. They gave concerts, whites-only concerts, for local audiences at local churches over a couple of days. In the evening, they spent their nights with the Bird Whistles. And the African-American residents of Fort Collins gathered in the Bird Whistles' home for worship services and to sing hymns with the singers. The next year, in 1929, the Bird Whistles put up, believe it or not, 22 Pullman porters at their home on 1009 West Oak Street. Where they all slept is a bit difficult to fathom. The porters were in town for a Union Pacific meeting, and several of them had served with Charlie in the war. They were also war veterans from Kansas, and several of them had worked with him when he was a head waiter in Topeka before he moved west to Colorado. So these hosting events continued into the following decades. In 1937, African-American veterans in town for a VFW encampment stayed at the Bird Whistles. In 1937, the internationally known Williams Colored Singers, which was a gospel octet, performed at the First Presbyterian Church, and all 8 of them stayed with the Bird Whistles after their performance, and presumably anybody else who may have been traveling with them. In 1937, a visiting African-American professor and fellow veteran stayed with Charlie while attending a summer session at the college. During the war, Charlie hosted Negro soldiers and addressed groups of Negro soldiers down at Lowry and Buckley Fields in Denver. And by the way, the Bird Whistles, by looking at the census records, were the only Black residents on this block on West Oak Street at that time. Their neighbors were white laborers, store clerks, working class white people. The Black population was small in the 1920s and 30s. It began to decline in the 20s. While the African-American farming community east of us in Deerfield was at its height in the 1920s, in Fort Collins, the Klan was meeting twice a week on Remington Street and trying to build up a presence here. So what do these hosting events mean? They're more than just stories of African-American culture during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in our community. They represent the way that our local African American community and the travelers who came through here for various reasons managed and negotiated segregation in the Jim Crow era. The bird whistles were not just being kind. People who were willing to open their private homes to travelers made it possible for Black visitors to stay in Fort Collins overnight at a time when hotels were segregated. And the only Black hotels in Colorado were in Denver in 5 Points. So these visitors were, again, as I've said, many were US soldiers and veterans. Some of them were internationally known. Some of them were associated with the university. And we understand that most people who traveled through here knew about Deerfield, and certainly that was a safe haven and a place to stay. And after the Green Book came out in the late 1930s, where people had access in advance to where they could safely stay while they were traveling around the United States, they were able to note a couple of tourist homes, as they were called, which were private residences that would open their homes to Black travelers. So there were 2 in Greeley, on 12th Street on the east side of Greeley, none listed ever in Fort Collins. So in that era, we had the Bird Whistle home, not officially listed, but certainly serving in a similar function. And there may have been others, we don't know at this time. So how should we recognize the significance of this place, this otherwise humble structure? Is it a private residence for a Black resident who is well known by the entire community? Certainly it was, but the significance of the residence is also intrinsically tied to how Black people negotiated the establishment of communities in Colorado at that time, and how they navigated their professional and public lives in an environment of structural racism. So again, that unlisted tourist home function, just with a few hours of additional research, we were able to make that case. And this is a really good example of how, when we look at things from a different angle and we take advantage of what we know about regional and national patterns of history, we can deepen these stories and we can challenge some of these narratives.
Okay. And so part of being able to tackle those complex stories comes with awareness. And I think for this slide, this is something when we were talking to our department colleagues, many of them are not aware of some of the context, the studies, the survey projects that commission members may be a little bit more familiar with. Because those contexts, that research we've already done, helps us target where we're going to spend our efforts. I think the survey work for the Sugar Factory neighborhoods in Tres Colonias is a good example of that. And that's that Sugar Beet Workers Shanty that's in the upper right is kind of an example of that. Unfortunately, that particular shanty was demolished. But we do have some of those important stories. I did want to call attention, the commission's also probably familiar with the 629 South Howes project, the Geller Center. And this is just an example of how sometimes we end up learning things from our survey process. Because this was one that when it was first surveyed, it was just identified as a reasonably significant example of Foursquare architecture, and that was kind of it. And so the development proposal focused on removing that, that funky little 1950s office edition on the front of it, to return it back to that Foursquare. After digging a little bit deeper about what the heck the Geller Center was and its relationship to Fort Collins history, it completely changed the story and changed how we sought to preserve this and incorporate it into the development for this for the site. And if you're not familiar with the Geller Center, this was established initially as the Westminster House. It was, of course, a Foursquare residence first, but the Presbyterian Church acquired this in the 50s and established this as effectively a Presbyterian Student Services Center for folks at Colorado State University. 1962, though, was a pivotal year because that's the year that Robert Geller was assigned to this. He's a Presbyterian minister and was assigned to this center and just transformed it into a broader social justice center. It became a welcome place for Native American students who, in the 60s were coming in frequently from out of state, didn't have a lot of safe places to go. So they were welcome here. Geller engaged Tres Colonias. He attempted to improve living conditions there and started pressing for broader social justice in Fort Collins, and also allowed this space, with that office addition included, to be kind of an incubator space for organizations that might carry forward that mission of improving the community. And some of those might sound familiar. So the Fort Collins Food Bank, that is now the Larimer County Food Bank, Black Student Services on campus, the Alternative Spring Breaks program at CSU, Point Drug and Alcohol Center, which I believe transitioned into what's now Turning Point, and then also establishing the first hospice care program at Poudre Valley Hospital. It's something else that Geller's associated with and credited for. None of this, again, is apparent from the street, and but is pivotal in how we understand the importance of the site and what it means to Fort Collins. It's effectively the starting place of our modern social justice movements here in Fort Collins. And much of that happened in the building, including the office addition on the front. And so as part of that learning process, as part of that research, we're able to reposition the development for this site so that the 50s edition is being retained. It's going to be bedrooms instead of offices, but the development's going to incorporate this instead. And so that's just an example of how digging deeper into that history and digging deeper into stories that are not obvious from the street has benefited and provided a more powerful association with these sites. What we don't know, again, I won't belabor this too much with the commission just because many of you are familiar with the gaps in history in general and some of the biases associated with the sources we work with. We know that a lot of our sources are produced by white middle class and upper class individuals, and that's why we tend to have our preservation choices skewed towards white middle class individuals, which is, again, it's part of the story, but it's not the full story. So how we're trying to tackle this, one is just new context, doing new research. Maren and I are in the beginning stages of developing a civil rights context that's probably going to be grant funded, likely broad in scope in terms of what we mean by civil rights. That'll probably include Black civil rights, Latinx civil rights, and El Movimiento, gay civil rights moving into the 60s and 70s, gender equality, that sort of thing. So that's one example, is just continuing to improve upon the research we already have and expand that knowledge into new areas, but also broadening methodology. This is a critical one for us, is getting out of the habit that preservationists tend to get into, which is just hire a consultant, do the research, put it on the shelf, reference it when you need it, and do a lot more public engagement. Because we know that there are stories out there that we're not capturing, oral histories and things like that that aren't in our traditional record base. But more importantly, we're also not necessarily asking communities what matters to them. And that, in terms of moving forward with our methodology, that's an important part of that, is making sure that we're including people across the board in deciding not only what history is important to remember, but what places are most important to reflect that.
So, of course, what we don't know is vast, as Jim said, and as we've been considering these issues, we've been discussing just from a basic standpoint of what our responsibilities are as we move forward, what we're resolved to do to engage in things that are going to take, a lot of time. And so, one thing we know is, as we've tried to outline here tonight, is that we have practices and assumptions that have served us in certain ways over time and have also created some significant blind spots over time. And as a profession, we are wrangling with this. And that's a good thing, because it gives us an opportunity to walk through that with a lot of other people who are going through similar things and to learn from other communities. So just looking at what we're doing here in Fort Collins, at every opportunity we have, whether we're landmarking a single property or we're exploring a particular chapter of our city's past, we need to be thinking about putting together history that serves the community today. And so really that has to be, again, those complex stories that don't just rely on the feel-good celebrations that are easier to talk about, but also some of those hard truths. And we're committed to the ongoing use of equity assessment tool that the city has adopted, which allows us to evaluate any city program, process, whatever that may be, and understand how it may be succeeding or falling short in terms of our equity goal. So that's going to be a big piece for us as well as we become familiar with that tool and are asking our colleagues on both staff and then in the community beyond to participate in that assessment process with us. And then, you know, as much as we deal with buildings and places, you know, you've, I think, all been exposed to that new mantra of our profession that we hear at our conferences and trainings, which is that preservation is for people. And at its best, it's a tool of creating community that's grounded in an honest accounting of our past. And then there's the whole question of expert knowledge. And, you know, just what do we do with broadening participation in a particular context in which expert knowledge is not just valued, but actually required in order to be hired in jobs like Jim and Karen and I have. And so, you know, if we've got advanced degrees in history and we're working with folks in the community who have different approaches and maybe no training in history, how do we work together effectively? And that is a big sea change that we're seeing, again, in other communities as well. What public historians talk about is sharing authority, which is really just breaking down those barriers that have been built up over time that rely heavily on professionalized production of information and less so on that community dialogue and community input into that process. And so really what it comes down to is that we need more people at the table with us as decision makers. We need more diversity on the commission. That needs to be, you know, something that we're paying attention to at every opportunity. And we need to bring our community to the table with us whenever we can. And just on a project specific level, I wanted to tell you just a few things that are happening on the staff work plan that again are kind of shifting. You know, with our landmark histories, where again, when we bring those stories forward to you for consideration under our significance criteria, we are committed to doing a better job of providing those fuller stories and also using those stories that we're developing as we do that research of when we're landmarking a property to build on, to create outreach programs where we can further educate the public about our community history. And again, the idea there is that our collection of landmarked properties represent everyone in the community. That's a fundamental building block for an equitable historic preservation program. And we've got a long way to go. At this point, we don't even know, you know, how many of we haven't done that analysis to really understand what do our landmark properties represent in terms of different aspects of our city's history and where are those gaps. The other thing that's coming up is street naming. And, you know, the street naming process, which has traditionally kind of lived in the planning department, is a really interesting one. You know, we found a 1907 article that's shown here about an early kerfuffle related to street naming right after the sugar factory had been built. And there was just an immediate revisiting of the city pioneer street names that had you know, been put in place when the town was originally being built out. And we had folks coming forward like President Aylesworth from the college saying, let's change them all to names that celebrate our agricultural heritage. So let's have Sugar Beet Drive and Lamb Drive. And so even back then, you know, they were talking about what is categorically appropriate for street naming. And in today's context, we understand that street naming, like other forms of memorialization, which is, in many ways what it is when we name streets after people, is probably always going to go through those waves of discussion and controversy, and at some points more than others, particularly at times of particular growth, or in the moment that we're living in now with the Black Lives Matter movement. We're going through another moment where people are looking at how our public infrastructure reflects our community history in ways that are both good and bad. So we see some of the suggestions that have come forward to us as staff related to, for example, Custer Drive, as an opportunity to look at the process for street naming in two different ways. One is to make sure that we have an inclusive process for the consideration of some of those street names that might be considered controversial, and what's the appropriate process to revisit those if at least a portion of the community desires to do so. Second, we can also work towards a better process for naming new streets so that we have equity standards in mind. And again, those recommendations that are going forward to council are going through a community recommendation process so that they have better information to consider when they're making those decisions. And then, we have other really important planning issues going on in the community right now. We're in the middle of developing on a really rapid schedule a strategic housing plan, which has all kinds of implications for our existing building stock and for preservation. And so, we know about opportunities to create affordable housing projects in historic buildings or historic areas. We understand that sometimes that involves compatible infill, like the Oak 140 project, and other times it involves adaptive reuse of historic buildings. But what we, I think, are wrangling with in a newer way is how our existing building stock in the neighborhoods represents a form of affordable housing. It was built as affordable and attainable housing, and it can continue to serve that need if we take certain steps to ensure that happens. So this duplex that has recently come forward for landmarking is a great example of that. That was great to share with other staff members. And in many cases, as you know, there are opportunities to densify existing neighborhoods, and what we are looking for there is ways to communicate what the preservation priorities are, and also to think more expansively about how that densification can occur in existing neighborhoods through things like ADUs that are, or more compatible multifamily projects that are coming into neighborhoods in some places where that's appropriate. So again, important staff priorities that intersect directly with that equity priority and priority goal.
And we wanted to close with a couple of just current priorities, current projects. A lot of these the Commission's already heard about before, so you're familiar with a lot of our survey projects, including what Sherry Albertson Clark's working on. I think we've brought a note on the revised web map that has all of our landmark data, and we'll have our survey data on there as well. So people can start accessing that. It'll start out as kind of a read-only function, and then we hope to link the actual survey forms to that in the long-term future. And a lot of that's just, some of that's just, public transparency and access, but a lot of it is also strategic planning for staff so that we can better understand, as Marin related to, the gaps that we have. Where have we just not surveyed? Or if we have, it's been a reconnaissance level that doesn't have a lot of substantive information in it. So the Holy Family neighborhood is one of those. I mentioned we're looking at various context reports and other research projects that engage the community a little bit better. One is the Civil Rights Project. We're also partnering with Colorado State University's History Department to strategically plan out some partnership projects over the next couple of years that will hopefully have a longer term impact. And we're also trying to do more collaborative community events. And some of that's practical. We don't have a lot of social media capacity and online presence beyond the website. Some of that is strategic. So this year is a great example where Patty Smith with Zonta and the Living Her Legacy project That's a downtown public art project, partnered with us to create a Her Story Fort Collins program series, which is this month. It's celebrating the centennial of ratifying the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. So we've got presentations on the next few Saturdays. In fact, had one this past Saturday where our own graduate intern, Leslie Moore, presented on her research about women's suffrage here in Fort Collins during the 1890s up through the 1920s. So we've got that. Martin and I will be presenting a virtual walking tour of suffrage sites around downtown Fort Collins this Saturday at 2 o'clock. So I'd certainly invite, I think we sent out an email invite to all the commissioners earlier with login information. Everything's going to be hosted by Living Her Legacy on their Facebook page and YouTube channel. So if you can't tune in live at 2 p.m. On the Saturdays coming forward, all those videos are going to be hosted on those pages into the future, so you can watch those at your leisure. But that's kind of a sampler of where we hope to go and what we're doing right now. But I did want to also mention, as we kind of close out, what our idea is with the commission is to come to you. We're probably going to come back to the commission on a regular basis on these equity topics. And the motivation for that is not only do we want to share with you the stories of the work we're doing and the people we're connecting with, and also kind of check in about, what stories should we be telling, but also in engagement strategies, who we're talking to, how we should be functioning. So we're going to keep kind of interrogating the commission about methods and how we do our business, whether it's design review, landmarking, community outreach. So this is very much intended to be a community-driven process and a kind of a group-driven process. Maren, did you have any last thoughts before I hand it back to Meg?
I don't think so. Just would love to hear what any initial questions or feedback that you all have at this time.
Absolutely.
That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much.